Okay, so we're going to start in just a minute. For those of you who must check your email, right? I always debate whether to give out information about the Wi-Fi in the building when you're at an event, and you're supposed to be. I used to teach here at CityU before I took on this role, so I had lots of stuff going on with the students and their iPhones. So you want to go to the in your choices of Wi-Fi. If you choose that, it will ask for your email. You're going to give it your email, but you're going to know that it doesn't retain your email. Okay? All it does is you're proving that you're not a random person just picking up the Wi-Fi. Okay? So if you need to. All right? And any other questions of a administrative sort? All right. Great. So I think, Alina?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me if I don't use the microphone? I just talk like this. Okay. All right. I'm going to fidget at the same time. Okay. My name is Alina Santillan. I'm a major gift officer at KEXP. I'm going to share my pronouns with you. So my preferred pronouns are she and her and he and him. I don't fit in that. I don't identify in that binary. The reason I think that that's important to call out is, one, I think it's important to be authentic to myself. And I think within the past year, I haven't been. And I think that when you're authentic with yourself, you can do your work better. And I also think another important point, and the reason I say that is because I'm going to be talking about making our spaces inclusive to everyone and how that fits into a culture of philanthropy. So I'm going to start by saying my girlfriend's a genius. When I was preparing for this talk, I was really getting bogged down in the minute details, how am I going to talk about this specific topic that I bring to this panel conversation, because I could talk about it every day. We could have a whole workshop for days and you would never leave. She was like, why don't you just start with the definition of philanthropy? And I was like, oh my gosh, you're a genius. That's so smart. I should totally start that definition. So this is one that I found. Philanthropy is the desire to promote the welfare of others. It is an act or gift made for humanitarian purposes. So what does it mean to create a culture of philanthropy in our organization? How do we help people see that their time, their talent, and their treasure, or their ability to give, help fulfill our missions in our organization? Because an organization who's created a healthy culture of philanthropy will see that in their employees. People want to give their time, they'll want to give their talent, and if they have the ability to give, they'll want to do that as well. But how do we get there? How do we create an inclusive space for everyone to have their voice not just heard, but listened to? How do we empower those people? How do we invite the communities that we're serving to have a stake at the table? So we allow people to do their best work and help our organization thrive. Everybody with me? Okay, here we go. So today, I'm going to talk about how to apply a racial equity lens to our culture of philanthropy. For the context of this conversation, I identify as a person of color working at a mostly white-led organization. So that's the experience that I'm going to be speaking from. How many people are in direct service? So homelessness, poverty, nobody? Wow. So is everybody arts and culture organization? Housing? Yes. Yes, where you're directly raising money to help improve people's lives. Sorry. Okay. I need to communicate better. Okay. So you might be asking why lead the conversation with race? Why not do another ism like sexism? Who's experienced sexism in the workplace? Every female identified person in this room should be raising their hand because you've experienced it whether you've noticed it or not, right? But this is why we're going to talk about race as opposed to other isms that we might experience. Is anybody familiar with Diana Falchuk? She works for the city of Seattle and there's Race and Social Justice Initiative. And this is why she says we approach equity with race at the forefront. She says we approach equity for all people through the lens of race because we know that across all measures and in all areas of life, from the arts to education, housing, jobs, criminal justice, the environment, and beyond, people of color are the most impacted when it comes to inequities. By understanding the barriers and injustices facing those who are most impacted, we're able to leave no stone unturned in our work to create an inclusive, equitable experience for our staff and our community. So the reason I asked about the direct service is I think there's a couple of points that are very important in what she's talking about. If people in direct service, if housing, criminal justice, if the foster care system are disproportionately affecting people of color, then we need to go and participate in those communities and listen to those people. It's really hard to decide, I know what's best for you, unless we're empowering and engaging those communities authentically. It's not to say that white people don't also experience homelessness and failures of the criminal justice system, that they don't also experience crises in health and have been a part of the foster care system. But we need to be honest about ourselves and like, whose story are we telling and why do we get to tell it? Right? I think another important point that she makes is she used the word inclusive instead of diversity. There is an amazing activist that I follow. He has a podcast called Pod Save the People. His name's Drury and he talks about the difference between diversity and inclusion. Can anybody give me what they think diversity is? What do you think diversity is about your organization?
Be working with each other.
Okay. What about inclusive? What does inclusive look like? That was a little harder.
Go ahead. Everyone feels safe to speak from their point of truth.
Mm-hmm.
To
Yeah.
contribute to the whole.
Yeah. So Drury talks about diversity is about bodies. It's about people in a space. It's like, look, we have this brown person on our pamphlet or this black person on our website. Isn't that great? Inclusive is about making sure that those people have a voice at the table, making sure that those people feel empowered. That's about creating a culture that is inclusive. It's about, and you can apply that to other things too. I think for KEXP, when we've started approaching our equity work with race, there are other things that have come up. Like our bathrooms accessible for trans people and people who don't identify in a binary. We recently had an event where we had a donor who's deaf who came to an event that we had, so we got ASL interpretation. We wouldn't have been thinking about those inequities, and we probably wouldn't have been thinking that maybe deaf people also enjoy experiencing music, that they get something from that, had we not started with that conversation about race. Okay, gotta make sure I'm not rambling. Okay, good, I'm not rambling. Everyone's still with me in this? Okay, awesome. Okay, I'm gonna use that. So this is a point that I took. If we're going to be equitable, inclusive fundraisers, meaning everybody across the organization, no matter what their role is, meaning everybody is giving their time, their talent, their energy, their effort, if they're able to give financially, that they're doing that too. To create a culture of philanthropy where our staff, our interns, our volunteers, and the communities of people we are serving feel empowered, valued, and listened to, again, not just heard, then we need to apply a racial equity lens to every area of our work. I'm going to use this as an example, and I've already talked to Libby about it. We talked about it as a panel, but what was something that you noticed in the invitation that went out for this panel? Did anything stand out to you that was like, that's weird? It's free. There's no cost. The image was all white people. That's what I was going at. And they look really happy. I don't know what they're talking about, but they are like, oh my God, yes, I want to give you all of my money. There's no people of color. Did that feel accessible to me? Did that feel accessible to other people of color to have that conversation? I think another part of that is when we were talking to Libby about it, and I don't usually have this experience when I'm talking to other white folks, was she was like, you know what? I'm embarrassed by that, and also that was my privilege in not seeing that. That was my privilege in being like, that looks like a great photo. Everyone looks happy. They're talking about giving. People are going to be excited about giving if they see other people excited about giving. But are the communities we serving reflected in the images that we're putting out? Do they have a voice in the stories that we're telling, especially in things like housing, especially in the foster care system? Are those people being empowered, or are they being tokenized? Are we putting brown and black people on our panel or on our website or on our pamphlet because they're empowered to share their story and give their voice, or because we think that looks better and has a better story to tell to our donors. Bringing that all back to also KEXP and where we are as an arts organization, we by no means have this all figured out. This is a process for us. We've started by applying, we created a racial equity team that has a mission and goals to work towards, that has representation throughout our organization. We've also started creating affinity groups for people of color and for white people so that people can experience their shared stories together and have a safe space to do that. I think another thing that we've been doing is we've brought in different consultants and different organizations, created different partnerships with other organizations who may be a little bit further along in this work to hold ourselves accountable to that. So there are practical ways that you can apply a racial equity lens to your specific job and how you're doing your philanthropic work. Another point too, I think, is when you make an inclusive space for people at your organization, you're going to see an increase in philanthropy, especially when you start with your core people, the people that you work with. How many people of color are on your executive team? We don't have any people of color in our executive team at KEXP. Going back to being transparent, we need to be transparent with our community. We need to be transparent with ourselves when we're talking about race and how we apply that. If we're going to create a culture of philanthropy, we're in Queen Anne, right? It's called Uptown. Does that feel accessible to people of color? Probably not. Is it accessible by bus to get to us? The events that we have, do we make those spaces accessible? What bands are we playing? Are we playing all white indie rock dudes? I like white indie rock dudes too. But I want some culture. I want some definition. If we're going to pride ourselves as an organization of championing music discovery is another topic, goes to colonialism. I could talk about that all day too. But when we're highlighting, elevating the voices of other people, are we making that an inclusive space for us? When we're talking about race, are we looking internally or are we looking externally? Oh, I saw racism today on the bus. Okay, how did you play into that? Or how do we play into those systems of oppression? We have to start talking about that if we're going to make huge jumps and have huge successes in making lasting impact, like you were talking about in the foster care system. So I'm going to leave you with this. I have a lot of resources, so if you want them, I have them. I'm not just like, go and be anti-racist in your workplace. Because that's overwhelming. Do that. Another important point to make, too, that I want to call out, because I feel like this always happens in conversations about that. Don't go to the Black person or the Asian person or the Hispanic person at your job and be like, oh my gosh, I feel so bad. How do I fix this? It's not their job to teach you. There are other amazing white people like Diana Falchuk who are doing this work that can give you those resources and those highlights to be able to take this back and to give you practical ways of how you can do that in your workplace. Yeah, so to bring that all back, I think if we're going to create a culture of philanthropy, if we're going to do what Peter was talking about when we're having the things that stood out for me, obviously gratitude and community, but hospitality, integrity. Are we making our spaces inclusive? Do people want to be a part of that? Let's dispel that narrative that people of color don't have money, that community colors don't want to give, because that's what we do. White people have money, people of color don't. Let's change that narrative because it's not true. We need to go and participate in those communities and engage. We need to invite those voices in so that they feel empowered and have a voice at the table so that we can make lasting change, especially if those communities are the ones that are directly and most impacted. We need those voices, right? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It's obviously a huge honor to be here today and to be with these esteemed panel. Can everybody hear me? So let me see. First of all, thank you, Treehouse. I'm a foster kid, so I'm thrilled whenever I see outcomes like that. Today I want to talk about my experience at Bloodworks, and then I want to talk about, leave you with at least a curiosity about the impact investing sector. We're not going to answer a lot of I'm not going to provide a lot of answers today, but really more put you in a position to ask some really exciting questions that unlock extraordinary opportunities for revenue. I should also say that I'm a stutterer, so I have a speech disability, but usually if I say one of my horrible flaws, then I won't stutter. So if it seems like I'm pensive and trying to think of just the right word, that's exactly what's happening. Okay, so Bloodworks Northwest is an extraordinary organization. We are very, very large. We do a lot of great work. And when it comes to inculcating a culture of philanthropy at Bloodworks Northwest, donor and donation refers to blood donation. So there's a lot of my team in the room today. It's a whole department of awesome. And so we have a great luxury and a huge obstacle that when people think about donating to Bloodworks Northwest, they think about donating blood. So the scope of generosity that flows through Bloodworks Northwest every day, 250,000 times a year, someone's giving blood at Bloodworks, that's pretty extraordinary. So some of our most dedicated donors and trustees are blood donors. People are in a rush to tell me that they give blood. The City University president this morning definitely wanted to share that he gave blood. People have a deep attachment to it. So, and that's great foundation to build on, but it is a large infrastructure to sort of move towards and donate money. So, so I have a tendency to go on. So I'm going to time myself here for about 11 minutes more. So it'll keep me at 15 minutes, but I just want to talk about what I did in the first couple of months at Bloodworks that sort of transformed and accelerated the path of board engagement, of influencing across the organization, across all our many divisions and states to really get on board with our department. And our department's called Investments and Partnerships. And it was the work of a dear friend of mine whom we should all become acquainted with at Altruist Partners, Donald Summers, who definitely laid the groundwork for me to be successful so far in my position. But one of the things that was really important in that was concepts of social enterprise, social entrepreneurship, social innovation, impact capital, social impact, and impact investing. I'm using this broad array of terms because all of those are kind of at play in the impact sector. And oftentimes when folks know that I've done work in impact investing, they really want to talk about the investment because we want that money. And it's the impact and how you prep yourself as an organization to be successful on impact that secures the investment. And I think it's great for to make my points for my section today that I've come at the end of this session. For example, if you, as an organization, if you're looking to secure an impact investment deal and you're going through the due diligence process or deal flow, that part of the process where they come in and kick the tires of you as an organization, if your issues with racial equity, with diversity and inclusion, and all the ESG or environmental, social, and governance issues of your organization are not tight and transparent and authentic and real and modern, you're unlikely to secure that investment. So if you are working on behalf of foster kids who are largely people of color and your board is entirely white and your staff are entirely white, there's going to be a disjuncture there, and that's not really going to meet the standard or threshold to secure an impact investment. So what that does, it sets up someone like myself or you or everyone here sort of at the crux of asking some pretty hairy questions of your organization. If you have 36% turnover in your direct service line, they're going to ask questions about that. But what I really want to do is bring attention to the scope of revenue available in the impact capital sector. I brought 30 handouts, and Dr. Emily Fawcett in my department made this handout for me because I'm not really good with the PowerPoint slides. But really what's important here is to emphasize that the scope of capital available in the impact investing sector dwarfs what's available for charitable donations. But in 2020, JP Morgan estimates that the impact capital sector will have approximately $1 trillion available for investment. And that, we know USA Foundation, USA Giving USA Foundation estimates in 2020 we might be at $450 billion in charitable giving. So it's a difference of degree that is so intense. Yes. And so this was exactly the phrase that I was approached from my board, and they asked me to do a presentation 1 month into my tenure, my position. So they said, tell us what impact investing is. And so there's a broad array of terms that folks use. They use social impact, social capital, impact investing, and impact capital. But really what it is this, a mix of, it's a range along a continuum that can include socially screened investments. Probably everyone here in the room is already an impact investor. You're considering how your spending in the market it affects the environment, affects other people on the planet, or a whole range of issues. A lot of folks will, how we're actually spending our money. We're starting to ask beyond the environmental impact of the food that we eat and how it's produced, how is it affecting the communities who produce that food? What's going on those farms? And so that is something I think all of us are doing. You see that more and more every day. But how an investment fund is the environmental, social, or governance impact of your investment. Say you prefer in your retirement account to purchase green instead of Exxon. You prefer to purchase. So that's one aspect of impact investing. And if you go down a continuum, it goes all the way to philanthropy. In the middle, you've got deals that have no return or a concessionary return on that investment. But basically, we're talking about private capital, equity capital, and investments outside of the sector of philanthropy. You can have a blended deal that can have a philanthropic gift, an investment that has no return, like a no interest loan. Many buildings that you see around town that were built for a lot of our partners in the field of nonprofits are the money to actually put those buildings together is structured this way. And then on the tail end, you can have philanthropic gifts that have impact in mind. And the folks that are making those philanthropic gifts are actually have almost a shareholder's understanding about the impact and about the return on their investment. The return they're looking for is the social impact. And those of us like myself who've been in nonprofits their whole career are familiar with all the grants that we've gotten that we didn't quite meet the goals that we set out. That's a different sort of expectation that a lot of folks who are grounded in the financial sector expect that you're going to fulfill the terms of the contract. So I really love that part of the impact capital sector because you're really looking at a rigorous analysis of how are you getting to the impact. And I think that puts us in a position as the folks at Altruist Partners to say, instead of nibbling around the edges of the problems that we're looking to address, how do we really just hugely leapfrog up into really getting at the root of problems and trying to solve the issues as opposed to just being better administrators of the current state of suffering that we find ourselves in. So I know working in nonprofits my whole life, you do get a sense that you're sort of chipping away at a huge problem. And in fact, at Bloodworks, with sort of commercializing some of the intellectual property that we have as a result of having an academic institute studying blood and really working in partnership with communities and nation states all around the world, we're actually at a point where our board of directors and our staff are actually saying we can change the face of access to transfusion around the world. And that's our goal. How do we really say, what the hell are we going to do to make sure we can make that happen? And the way to do that is to, one important way to do that is to link up with the impact capital sector, because the scope of money available there and the kinds of partnerships and expertise that come with those, with that, come with that participation. So have I explained impact investing or impact capital enough for conversation today? Yeah. Well, it's really not different from charitable giving. It may be a tax-deductible donation. It's a change of mindset in the donor's relationship. And it might be, say, folks talk about many foundations are opening up their endowments for impact investing, where we're not a part of that 5% gift that is mandatory and required by law, but in getting into the endowment and making gifts out of their endowment dollars. So that means different kinds of conversations and getting into partnership relationships with foundations and donors that are not about this is your required giving or this is your posted competitive grant applications, getting into let's be partners to solve this huge scale issue. What's it going to take for all of us to have these conversations together? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about social enterprise. Does that term mean anything to folks? So social enterprise also has a variety of definitions, and one of those is applying rigorous business analysis to the nonprofit sector. And that's what a lot of us are a little bit more familiar with that. It goes all the way to the other continuum, to the end of the continuum, where social enterprise really is a business, and that's this can be a nonprofit, can be a for-profit, where social good is an intended outcome of that business, in addition to either revenue or any other outcomes you might be looking for. Tom's is often cited as an example of a private business that has an intended social good. So social enterprise is a very important part of the impact capital sector, really because it is looking at, especially if you're taking that first definition, applying a rigorous business analysis to your nonprofit operations. To be able to do that effectively, you're going to ask a lot of questions that make you suitable for investment. That includes, what's your turnover rate? What are your what are the business analytics that you're looking at? How are you tracking your outcomes? How are you reporting your impact? And how would you be a steward of an investment? Would you be able to accept a transformational gift of 7 figures or more? Many of us in philanthropy are like, whoa, I can't wait to get that big gift. A lot of us wouldn't know what to do with it effectively, much less report on it later. But if your organization can be investment grade, the part that I love about that the most is when you're going through a due diligence process, you're going to be asked questions by those folks who are vetting your organization for investment that really get to equity lens conversations in a way that makes the business case. There are many reasons we should be looking at our organizations and their impact through many types of equity lenses. There's also a business case to do so. And for example, we had a firm in a couple weeks ago, and they were asking us questions about women's leadership in the organization and racial inclusion in the organization. So we had a conversation for about an hour before I realized they were asking me that question, not because they were politically or socially motivated, but because they believed, based on the facts and the numbers, that that made the most sustainable organization that would both get to their impact and be the best return on investment. The business case is that being able to address issues of diversity in a meaningful and substantive way, to call out those 400-pound elephants in the room, are really make you the most investment worthy. So it is really, I love the way that it all comes together to help engender a situation where we're having real conversations, not just about who we are and what our impact is, but we're doing that in a way together with corporate, private equity, and foundation partners so that we can actually find the kind of resources and have well-built, well-maintained nonprofit machines so that they can actually solve the problems that they're looking at. Make the kind of transformations in care and outcomes that Treehouse has done, that so many other organizations have done, who've really taken these bold steps. Is it easy? No. Is $100 million going to fly in the door tomorrow? No. But to begin to ask the questions, I hope you leave today saying, wow, looks like there's a lot of money in impact investing, and it helps me address issues internally and externally around impact, equity, and where we're going as an organization, and that being truly honest and authentic about that in a way that sometimes can put development staff in a difficult situation in terms of kind of conversations you need to have internally. And at Bloodworks, we often talk about our internal marketing campaign. I do a lot of work as an executive there of like cultivating interest in and talking about investor confidence. In order to be an investment grade organization, we have to actually care about our investors. And in that way, it's so much linked to a culture of philanthropy. It's so much linked to who are we, who do we have, how do we have relationships, and how do we really serve as a pathway to unlock humankind's highest aspirations around generosity, compassion, loving kindness. And it turns out a hell of a lot of money.
Any comments you guys have each other?
So one of the challenges, this is hello. So I'm with Habitat for Humanity, Seattle King County, and one of the challenges that we face in our culture of philanthropy that I'm seeing is that there's a lot of turnover, and I'm sure it's very similar with a lot of nonprofits. And you mentioned a little bit about training new staff, and I'm wondering if you can go, Jessica, maybe anyone else, into more detail about how to build a culture of philanthropy on a continuous basis when there is a lot of turnover of staff. And we have a lot of AmeriCorps members. I'm sure a lot of other nonprofits do. So we face that as a challenge because the culture of philanthropy seems to change a lot as the culture changes with the nonprofit. So I'm wondering if you could speak more.
Thank you for that. And so I guess I would say, so a culture of philanthropy exists in your organization now. Like all of your organizations have a culture of philanthropy. And so when I did my initial work, I was getting a baseline. Like, where are we in the things that we want to impact? In sort of strategic interventions to sort of have an impact to cycle that. And so we have developed an onboarding process for our education specialists and for our entire staff based on how do we bring people into this organization and get them, because we've doubled in size in scope and money, but also in number of staff. New people to bring on for us as a relatively small organization to now we're at 100 people. And that's a big growth. From 50 to 100 is that was a big movement for us. And so what we did is we realized that we need to have a very strategic onboarding process. That's for training for your role, for the organization, the expectations, and culture is going to exist whether it's going to grow around you or you can be purposeful about what you want to grow. And so we decided to be purposeful about culture of philanthropy, and we include that in the onboarding process. We have cohorts of people that come on, and then as soon as we have a critical mass or quarterly, they go through sort of the organizational onboarding process. And that is meeting with HR, meeting with other key stakeholders, volunteering in our warehouse, having itemized things to just familiarize with the organization. And then you meet with all 5 executives in an hour-and-a-half meeting where each of us have 20 minutes, and we all talk about, we have a slide deck that we've created and coordinated and aligned messaging so that our CEO leads off with the big picture. Our chief policy officer talks about our advocacy work, finance, administration, HR, IT are all together, and Ray-Un, he talks about all of those items. And then Angela Powell talks about our program model, and I talk about fundraising and development. But I do it from that particular group so that we're talking about culture of philanthropy. So my entire conversation is around culture of philanthropy and trying to embed that. And we gotta make sure that everybody's hitting everybody else's points in the same way.
I think you can also, I've seen, had success in other organizations, not in Bloodworks yet, I'm hoping to do this next year, but sort of building that excitement around philanthropy too.
To let folks, for example, having a cross-sector advisory panel from other parts of the organization where Hope sort of giving guidance about how to implement and get representing diverse perspectives. It'd be great if those folks, I've seen this work really well at a community health center, had a pot of money that they got to administer so they face the same kinds of excitements and challenges that donors do. So they're really actually themselves practicing as philanthropists. I think that can totally sensitize an organization because they become like sneezers in the Jim Collins sense to go out and infect everyone because they're living and it's actually something they're doing as in addition sort of along those show don't tell type of approach.
Well, no, just to state the obvious. Sorry, is this going in or out? Oh, it's not. Okay, sorry. I joined years ago in this city, AFP Advancement, and it was then AFP and NUA, now Advancement Northwest. And there's a forum every June for a couple of days for excellent training as a fundraiser. There's a National Philanthropy Day in the fall. It's coming up actually in November that celebrates folks in philanthropy in and around the city. And you know, that's from a training perspective, I would say as an organization, getting organizational membership or paying for, it doesn't actually cost that much for an organization to make sure that your folks on your team get that training. And with that comes things like mentoring opportunities. People can have year-long mentoring relationships with folks in the field. That's where I learned almost everything that I had learned was just through other peers, mentoring, training sessions, all that. So I would encourage your organization to look at what's the value and investment in membership in a fundraising professional organization. And Advancement Northwest is pretty outstanding.
I'm going to make a statement about this.
Let's talk about classism. So when you look at an AmeriCorps member, like they don't make a lot of money. So maybe you have the time, they definitely have the time to give and they have the talent to give, but they probably don't have a lot of treasure to give because they make such a small amount of money. So how can you empower those people in your organization who are not making a lot of money to recognize the impact of their work? I think when people feel valued and empowered, I know it is true for me. I want to give my time and my talent. And if I have some money to give, I want to give that to you. So thinking about that, the differentiation between the amount of people, the amount of money that people make in your organization, I think is impactful.
I don't need the mic. So I'm interested in this topic of like the tokenism. I've heard the value of telling stories and making sure you tell folks what the impact of your work is. In our organization, it's children-based, and we've been a little reticent to get the children telling their stories because of this tokenism. So maybe can some of you share ideas around how to do that in a more enlightened way? Because I feel like we're we're missing out on some really important stories because we're too afraid to ask people to speak about what their experience has been.
So, do you only have the children, or are you working with the families?
It's education, it's a school, so the children have parents, but it's like financial aid for a school. So,
Yeah, I totally. You're anytime you're dealing with kids, you're going to need to be sensitive to exploitation and all those other issues. So, definitely all the people around the child, whether that's administrators or their teachers or their family members, all those folks can. If you're telling a story of what it's like to be a part of your organization, if you have volunteers who can talk about the impact that service has had in their own lives, and even your donors. I mean, if you have existing financial donors, likely they're doing that because they're experiencing some personal benefit.
Yeah.
And so, what is that story? That's also has its own issues. It's going to have going on there, but when you can't go directly to the source, you're obviously going to need to go around it.
I think the difference between tokenizing and empowering, I'll give you an example. Like KEXP did, we were going to do a highlight on hip hop.
Yeah.
If I went up to someone who's black and was like, "You're black, you probably know a lot about hip hop." Maybe they really love The Cure. Maybe they don't like hip hop, right? That's tokenizing. However, if I'm like, you have your own hip hop programming, you do a radio show, I would love to hear your take on it. I'd love to hear your voice at the table sharing that experience. I think that that's different. I think when you're working with kids too, and going back to the point of being transparent, especially in the education system, let's look at the education system and brace yourself again, the school to prison pipeline, right? The school to prison pipeline. So this idea of communities of color and kids of color, specifically in the Black and African American community, the disproportion in the punishment that they receive as opposed to white kids, the amount of and the quality of the education they receive. We have to be able to talk about those root issues, just like you were saying, the root of the problem, not fixing the symptoms of the problem. So I think when we're talking about tokenizing versus empowering, are the stories that we're telling coming from the voices of people who are most affected, and are we willing to be authentic in that story? Like, hey, education system, we've failed people of color, we failed the communities of color, and these are the steps we're taking to remedy that, to better that. We're never going to be a society where racism doesn't exist. It's never been that way in the history of the world. But that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands like, well, we can't fix that, right? It's all about empowering and giving voice to the people who have historically not having a voice at the table and getting their perspective on that.
This is actually something we deal with a lot at Treehouse and work very hard to be thoughtful about. And because we are sharing youth stories, we're sharing the stories of families, we're sharing the stories, and these stories are filled with trauma. We from a trauma-informed practice and from understanding why you would tell this story. And our approach is every youth is paired with an ed specialist, and the ed specialists have about 25 youth that they work with. Each student is doing a program called Check and Connect, which is attendance, behavior, course performance. They're engaged with our activities for Little Wishes and for the Warehouse, which is our free store, and they're doing a program called Student-Centered Planning, which is about goal setting and career visioning and development. If sharing their story is part of their student-centered plan, from an empowerment perspective, then ed specialists will say this youth is ready and wants to share their story. But that's coming from the youth, it's coming from the partnership with the ed specialist, and then that youth is in control of that story, what they share, what they don't share, with coaching and guidance. Because also, like, you can't say that some youth, they haven't figured that out yet. And so we have someone who specializes in that, and they're paired with their ed specialist. And so, like, what does feel safe to share? What brings your point across and is empowering for you, rather than going to another place. We share stories. We also have a progression, so they might share with a smaller group, and then move on and through that process. And the youth are really in control to say, I'm done. I'm out. I don't want to do this anymore. That is totally fine. And that actually, that I speak from our youth perspective, but the truth is it's our ed specialists are in the same boat. They don't always want to share. We have a lot of alumni that work at Treehouse. They may or may not want to share their story. We also have certain events that we don't ask you to share because it's too exposed, it's too much. It gives us that feeling of like that doesn't feel right. And so we do have a group of alumni that have identified themselves as wanting to share their stories, wanting to be a part of this conversation and furthering it. And so in your particular case, if the kids aren't the right choice, kids who did receive scholarship, like moving to where you're going and what impact did that have for somebody? We often do that because it's really about what story do you want to tell? Do you have to tell the story of now, or do you want to tell the story of what's possible? And often the story of what's possible, like fundraising is very like of the now, right? It's transactional. It's this thing. Philanthropy is the long game, right? And it's about honoring and being a part of a larger conversation. And so, so that's what we do. It's not perfect, but we're trying really, really hard.
Maybe one quick when I was working for Splash in the global health space, so we felt very strongly that donors wouldn't necessarily meet kids or see schools or hospitals or orphanages directly where they were providing money for them. And so the visual storytelling of the organization was going to be terribly important to us. And so we had some ethical choices early on that were terribly important to us. And if you go to splash.org today, the same things are true today that were true when we started, which is every kid you see, every school you see, you're going to see joy and dignity and possibility. You are not going to, we used to say, no flies in the eyes and no distended bellies and no depression. Like that wasn't, we fundraising consultants and marketing consultants out there would tell us if we could show what some of us in the field call poverty porn, if we could show kind of human desperation, we might raise more money. And we said no to that. We said instead we will show all the pictures we can of really dirty water, right? We're going to show beautiful kids, really bad water. And we were very, very consistent. You'll see, I haven't been involved with Splash for a few years now. I promise you, if you go to that website, any video, any story, any visual, you'll see pictures of very bad water, but really beautiful, joyful kids with potential. And the whole image and the whole brand idea behind Splash was we were to join with kids' potential. Kind of the enemy in the story around kids' trajectory was the bad water, right? And it was so phenomenal that you could have a McDonald's in some country far from here, right? And around the corner, you'd have an orphanage, and the kids had terrible water. And McDonald's had the cleanest water in the country right there. And so we said our story is to move from where there is clean, secure water for people who can pay for it, and let's make sure that kids, right, in poverty, in schools, orphanages, and hospitals have clean water. And our storytelling prerogative, to your point, was to get us from the unjust situation through the child, right, to a different future. And I think that as fundraisers, our story is to go, is to do that. One way we do this at Make-A-Wish, it'd be easy to think about Make-A-Wish and go, oh, where do you kind of fit in this? Well, what keeps us awake every day at Make-A-Wish is that every eligible child, right, any child facing critical illness, we believe they ought to have the ability to have a wish, to do the thing that they can dream and imagine. And we know right now we can only serve about 3/4 of the kids who have wishes in a given year in Washington and Alaska. So we're going to stay up all the time thinking about what happens for that last 25% or maybe 30% of kids who don't yet have the ability to have a wish granted. Well, we're going to be driven by that gap between where we are today and some possible future when any eligible child can have a wish granted. I think you've got to figure out what that gap is, and it's not a picture of a starving kid, or right? It's a picture of a kid with dignity who deserves a different future. I think that's the story we have to tell.
I can probably do it better, Mike. You try it while I couple. So in listening to all this storytelling, I'm also really aware that hi Jessica, that my daughter used to work at Treehouse. That I'm aware of trying to also empower our board to tell their stories of how they're connected to the mission, and so I'm just wondering if you have any kind of takeaways for us to bring back to our board meetings and our boards to empower them to tell the story, the mission story.
Where are you going to go? That's your project.
Well, I think I'm going to go.
Oh, you go. You go. Yeah. Well, so my quick is there's an awesome TED Talk by Simon Sinek called Start With Why. And it outlines a logic flow from why to how to what. And I would encourage board members to start with understanding why on earth do you make sacrifices of your time, your talent, your treasure to be part of this mission in this organization. And when you can think deeply about why this mission means something to you, then you can even begin to move in this arena, right? After you can share why you're doing that, you need to be able to listen to a donor say why they might want to discover the mission. Now, that why conversation precedes everything else. When people trust each other around the why, when they build relationships around the why, and they believe each other around the why, now they're ready for how. How are we going to move forward, right? And that, again, is both storytelling and story listening around the how and building connection around the how. And then after that comes the what, which is what are we going to do about this? And what might be money, it might be volunteerism, it might be serving on the board, whatever that is. Simon Sinek's TED Talk points out that we too often in our society go from what to how to why. And people just are not with us. And the logic flows from why to how to what. I believe it profoundly, and it's really changed my career to follow that logic. So I would go there.
Yes, and. Which is actually, I'm glad that you went first, because tactically, I think that it's important to sort of understand that why, and there's so many formats for achieving that. You can do it as an entire board. We had one board meeting, a retreat, where we sat around and everybody talked, every single person. We had over 30 people on our board, plus the executive staff in the room, and we all told a story of why an adult in our life that made a difference and mentored us in some way that changed our trajectory. It took forever. Like, I'm not joking. We were all like, oh my gosh, but people hung with that. They listened, and we learned so much about each other and so much about why the people in that room were sitting in that room for this work. There's another format called open table conversations, where you sit in groups of 12. They call them Jeffersonian dinners. I don't like that name, but they're known as that. I call them open table dinners. Racial equity problematic things with the other name, and you sit around and you have a leading question, and you take that leading question and everybody talks for 2 minutes about like a time you've experienced, you did something that was unexpected in a situation, or how your relationship with fear, or just a sort of an open thing that leads everybody. So those are great ways to elevate some of that why. And then we, at Treehouse, we work with a process that we've built called board goals, which is encouraging board members to set their own goals, and then because you're more likely to achieve a goal that you set yourself. So rather than giving board members a laundry list of these are the 7 to 10 things we need you to do as board members, we say, what do you want to do to achieve in this work in the next year? And those 5 things are generally, they fit into sort of these 6 categories that I've developed. That board leadership would be one of the ways to speak and tell your story. Personally significant gift, introduction, and bringing somebody else into the organization. And it's amazing how the board goals that people set fit into these categories. And then over the course of the year, we track them. And we say, well, we have 164 board goals set. So far, we achieved 54. That is on target for the month that we're in. And we show that at every board meeting. And so that's a very tactical answer, but really it is about the why, and why are we sitting here, and why are we giving up our time? Because it's not easy. It's not easy to step away from work at 11:30 to come to a Treehouse board meeting. But so many people do that on the regular. Yeah. Your daughter's name is in my presentation that I printed off. So I saw you sitting there. I thought, oh my goodness, isn't that great?
She was so inspired by her work with you and getting that master's in social work. So she can keep going.
Yeah. She is a special human.
I think so too.
And I think the why part is super, super interesting. Like at Bloodworks, we have a very prestigious board, and we have their bios up, and we're in the process of putting up the why. Who's on our board, but why are they serving? Like, what's their hook? We've changed the titles in my department. We don't have event managers. I have a mission engagement officer, and her job is to not just have chicken and fish conversations with people, but talk to them about why they're there and create inordinate number of contexts for folks to engage with our mission. We have a science engagement officer. The team in my department of Bloodworks is extraordinary. I'm just honored to have them all on board. And we did our annual fundraising event, the big fundraiser. It's a whole other term, which is problematic. But at that event, it was the first year this year that we did not have a revenue strategy based on auction. We actually didn't auction off a single thing. We took that hour with people, and we made a science party. And we had VR, and we had really amazing people in wonderful dresses and suits having cocktails and acting silly like kids in a science exploration museum. And that event raised the highest amount of gross revenue of any event in Bloodworks history, and we didn't sell a single thing. And people gave us feedback like, wow, I kind of miss not buying stuff, but I spent more than I ever spent before. And I was like, that's exactly what we're going for here. And I just think it's really exciting because when you're talking with people about what you're doing, it's almost like you're getting to that place where the asking does itself. I can't get my board chair to stop calling me. I saw her on Friday, on Saturday, and this morning. She's amazing and incredibly engaged. And we have board engagement as a metric on our dashboard also. And what it is, when you're talking about the why you're there, it's good for your staff too. It's good for everyone involved to actually focus on what brings you to the table. So I forget what the origin of the question was, but I forget exactly what your question was, but every time you can have a mission conversation with someone, it really, the money is almost irrelevant in the end, because people who are truly bonded in a meaningful and authentic way, they're going to ask you, yeah, hey, looks like a bunch of white guys on your board. They're going to say, hey, wow, I can't wait to come down and give blood. I'm going to stop by. And then I really want to come see your African scholars that are visiting. They're really, all over you. And it's a beautiful thing to see that passion unlocked. And the financial investment is just another aspect that they'll bring to it if they have that capacity.
So we have time for one more? Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for being here. I've learned so much today. It's been really inspiring. I have a question that goes back to your talk about impact investing and social enterprise, and just this whole idea around systemic impact. And it's super powerful. I love talking about it, thinking about it. But then I'm also going back to your conversation about inclusion and how we engage people of color in this philanthropic world that we have. And I actually would like, if there's some way that both of you can respond to this. My story was, does this language actually impede people of color who are running small nonprofits from having a part of this global conversation? Or are there ways that they can access the types of investors that you have from a smaller nonprofit standpoint?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question. It's interesting that you say that. I was just talking over the weekend with a friend of mine in Arizona who just took a position with a private equity firm that is all, every person involved with the firm, as well as my good friend, are Latino. And they've all just activists since the 60s, Chicano movement, all of that. So that for them, they're doing investing around social determinants of health to amplify the impact of the Affordable Care Act. So they are specifically, these are all folks who are both of those things. Many of them have worked in nonprofits. They've used their relationships in the wealth management sector to help put together this particular investment firm. So when you go to an event like SOCAP, which is Social Capital Markets, SOCAP 18 will be coming up next year. Have a look at that. If you just SOCAP 18, if you Google that, it's a very interesting event. You go there, and some of our received notions about wealth managers are white guys who went to Harvard or Stanford. That kind of falls apart when you get into the global sector of impact investing. Just had someone from Morgan Stanley in our office on Friday. He certainly was not, he was an immigrant person from Afghanistan. So I think that's an interesting take on that.
these investors? If there, because there are a lot of nonprofits that are under $1 million. So how do they find their way into the systemic growth?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that path is not clear right now, but I think first of all, raising awareness of this capacity. Two, that's always going to be through board members and supporters. They're probably getting grants from Seattle Foundation, which is making impact investments, is in conversation with all the folks in the social impact sphere, sort of really through the same avenues you pursue through philanthropy, through wealth management. I don't know if folks ever heard of Seattle Philanthropic Advisors Network, but a lot of folks here, I've seen you there. This stuff is going on around you, and you are poised to take advantage of it, but just start asking those questions.
My response is they have to work twice as hard. People of color have to work twice as hard to get the same things that white folks do. I know that probably feels uncomfortable to say that, but when we look at the disparities in fundraising and in philanthropy, it's just true. There's does anybody know Rainier Valley Court? So Vu, yeah, he's awesome. So people who are unfamiliar, it is a nonprofit in Seattle that promotes social justice by cultivating leaders of color and empowering strengthening communities of color and fostering collaboration between diverse groups. So elevating voices of color, empowering them to have a voice at the table. So my response, first of all, is they have to work twice as hard. And then Vu talks about, I'm just going to read a little bit. It's so funny you asked that because he just wrote something on equity. And part of his definition is equity requires us to reassess and abandon rules and regulations and definitions that prevent resources from reaching the people most affected by injustice. Who created these rules and definitions? Who benefits most from them? We've been using the same inequitable process and definitions to allocate funding where the organization that writes the best grant proposals and has the best data gets awarded, which probably explains why there's inequities. Why not make decisions based on whether the board and staff are made up of significant number of leaders and communities being served? And I'm going to specifically say POC communities and leaders. And this is an important point too, because I feel like I get this back. He says, whenever I bring up these points though, there's always someone who says something like, well, how do we know that these minority-led organizations will be effective? This is another post for another time, he says, but this default burden of proof that is forced on marginalized communities, whereas the dominant cultures are automatically given trust and thus funding at the onset. If we do not believe as a sector, believe deeply that people who have firsthand experience of injustice would have the knowledge and expertise and thus are the most effective in solving those issues, then it's hopeless. And I would completely agree with that. I think this starts next year, but the Office of Arts and Culture is not going to give people grants unless you're able to show your racial equity plan. How they're going to prove authentic racial equity plans for organizations, I think would be interesting. And then I think the other point to make to your question is, who are the voices at the table? That's something that we're having very transparent, real conversations with at KEXP, because we don't have a person of color in our executive team. And I think maybe 2 people of color on our board, that is absolutely going to affect how we engage with communities. That's absolutely going to affect how we program. When we're doing remote spots, are we only going to Poland, France, Montreal, Nashville, Iceland? Why are we going there? Not that they don't have great music. I love Iceland. It was really expensive, but I had a great time. But why am I not hearing from El Sonido or Wilpop? Why am I not hearing from those cultures? So I think you really have to take a step back and people have to work twice as hard. Who are the voices at the table? And what does that racial equity lens look like for your organization?
So I would say yes and again, and say that I also, white people and me, I need to stand up and say what racial inequity is and when it happens. And that as a white person, it is my responsibility to not ask other white people for permission, but to break the rules that everybody has told me are true, but never told me. My society and white culture has told me not to talk about race. It's told me not to say when racism is happening, and I see it clearly, I know it, I can feel it, And it's my job to stand up and say, because I know that people of color have to work twice as hard. But if they have to like not take the burden or not work quite as hard because I'm willing to stand up and say what racism is and when I see it, or ask a question, hey, was that racism right there? Like, I think that might have been racism. And that I can challenge other white people to have conversations about race. And I can work really hard to listen and to make sure that if my voice doesn't need to be at the table, that it's not.
Great. No. Oh, I could do two. We're just about out of time. I know you have given a good part of your late morning. We're very invested in composting, recycling, and trash. So if you want to separate your things, there's bins over here for you to do that. And look forward to seeing you at another time. I have business cards here if I can pass that on to you, and I'm sure folks here would talk to you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Libby.
Oh, also, this has been recorded. It's going to be up on YouTube, and so you'll get an email if you want other people to be able to hear this. So how long?